How far can the patience of a Formula One legend go? What happens when even the most experienced driver in the paddock feels that the rules are not applied equally? Lewis Hamilton publicly exploded against the FIA after the 2025 Mexican GP, accusing it of unacceptable decisions that not only ruined his career, but could have defined his future at Ferrari. Was his penalty fair? Or are we facing another chapter of a much deeper conflict? Subscribe to continue uploading more of this type of content now, if we continue. Lewis Hamilton arrived in Mexico with an emotional backpack loaded with expectations, accumulated frustrations, and unprecedented media pressure. His signing for Ferrari was, without a doubt, the bombshell of the driver market. A union that mixed pure history with the promise of mutual redemption. Hamilton, seeking to close his legendary career with an 8th world title, and Ferrari, desperate to regain the glory it has not touched since 2007, signed a high-risk pact that from the first moment generated a wave of global enthusiasm, but also technical doubts. The first Grand Prix of 2025 were not easy. Ferrari, although it had shown significant improvements in 2024, was still struggling with adapting to the new aerodynamic demands of this season. The SF25, a fast but unstable car in changing conditions, did not behave with the predictability that Hamilton was used to having at Mercedes. The lack of feeling with the rear axle and the constant modifications to the balance of the car forced the Briton to modify fundamental aspects of his driving style. He himself admitted it after the race in Australia. He was learning to release the accelerator earlier and apply the brake differently, trying to imitate Charles Leclerc's technique to maximize the minimum speed in the corner. The most frustrating thing was that, despite the effort, the results were not coming. There was adaptability, but no reward. In Shanghai, for example, Hamilton showed a leap forward during the sprint quali, achieving a magical lap that positioned him as one of the fastest of the weekend. But in the race, small strategic errors by Ferrari and an operational execution still far from the level of McLaren or even Mercedes took away the possibility of transforming pure speed into consistent points. The media narrative, therefore, began to lean dangerously toward a perception of incipient failure. And so, against this tense backdrop, Hamilton arrived at the Autódromo Hermanos Rodríguez, a track that historically has not been favorable for Ferrari, but thanks to the improvements in traction and aerodynamic efficiency of the SF25 for this stage of the season, presented itself as a real opportunity. Since free practice, the Briton's pace was solid. But it was in qualifying where Hamilton shone again, third place on the grid, behind Norris and Verstappen, his best session of the year. A result that not only represented a step forward technically, but also emotionally. The euphoria in the Ferrari garage and on his face was evident. He felt comfortable, motivated, almost liberated. For the first time this season, the podium was a concrete possibility. What no one imagined was that this race, which promised to be the symbolic rebirth of the Hamilton-Ferrari alliance, would end up becoming the most controversial and exhausting episode since its arrival in Maranello. A succession of questionable decisions, both within the team and on the part of the FIA, would transform a day of hope into a nightmare that, to this day, continues to generate consequences. Because when you play with the motivation of a champion, the damage is not just sporting, it is deeply personal. The second part of this story takes us to the heart of the drama, the track of the Autódromo Hermanos Rodríguez. A historic, vibrant, unpredictable circuit, and this time, the scene of one of the most controversial decisions so far this season. It all started with an intense start, where the usual protagonists Hamilton, Verstappen, and Leclerc found themselves fighting wheel to wheel, in a first sector as narrow as it was treacherous. From the first meters, it was clear that it would not be a smooth race. But no one anticipated the breaking point that would come just on lap 6. At that moment, Max Verstappen, known for his surgical aggressiveness in overtaking, executed a move in turn 1 that would change the course of the race. He attacked from the inside, forcing the braking beyond the usual limit. The Dutchman managed to place his front axle slightly in front of Hamilton's mirror right at the apex, which, according to current FIA rules, gave him the right of trajectory. Contact between both cars was inevitable. Hamilton, out of space and on cold tires, was forced to leave the track. Until then, it seemed like a typical racing incident. And this is how it was evaluated by the commissioners, without penalty, without predominant fault. However, it was only the prelude. What happened immediately afterwards was what ended up unleashing the storm. Hamilton, determined to regain his position, took advantage of his momentum to attack around the outside into turn 4. But there, while trying to maintain the line on the outside, he blocked his left front wheel. That slight but crucial loss of control led him to take the escape route. At that moment, he made a decision that would be his sentence. Instead of following the complete re-entry path marked by the FIA, a long and tortuous route that forces the driver to give up time, he cut directly across the grass, rejoining the circuit aggressively and staying ahead of Verstappen. This technical detail is key. It wasn't simply that he went off track. It was that, upon returning, he ended up in a clearly more advantageous position compared to the point before the incident. For the commissioners, this was an unfair gain in position. And although it was recognized that his speed upon reaching the loophole was high and that there was a risk in taking the designated route, that did not exempt him from the responsibility of returning the acquired advantage. The 10-second penalty came several laps later. Late, poorly communicated by Ferrari, and with ambiguous language that further fueled Hamilton's anger. According to engineer Riccardo Adami, they informed him that the penalty was for the incident with Verstappen, without clearly explaining that it was specifically about the cut in Turn 4. That confusion was fuel for an immediate radio reaction that went viral. That's bullshit, man. What about all the other cars that cheated? The post-race analysis only added fuel to the fire. Telemetry showed that Verstappen had braked later than normal, pushing the maneuver to the limit, but technically meeting the requirements to not be penalized. On the other hand, Hamilton, when mowing the grass, gained several meters compared to his direct rival. From the FIA's point of view, the problem was not the overtaking attempt, nor even the prior contact. It was the non-return of the position gained and the way in which it was reinstated. What angered Hamilton's followers most was the inconsistency. Leclerc, on the first lap, had also gone off the track to avoid contact and did not return any position. Verstappen cut corners in Turn 1 in the same way, but only Hamilton was punished. And when decisions are not applied fairly, the regulation stops being a tool of justice and becomes a weapon of ambiguity. This incident encapsulated the central dilemma that plagues modern F1. What weighs more, the competitive spirit or literal compliance with the rules? And who decides when an infraction is serious enough to affect the development of a career? In Mexico, these responses left more doubts than certainties. And for Hamilton, it left a bitter taste that will hardly dissipate in the coming races. Because he didn't just lose a podium. He lost confidence in the system that is supposed to protect the integrity of the sport. The decisions made by the FIA at the 2025 Mexican Grand Prix cannot be analyzed in isolation. For many inside and outside the paddock, what happened to Lewis Hamilton was not simply an error in referee judgment, but one more example of a pattern that repeats itself with disturbing frequency. A pattern that calls into question the impartiality of the stewards and, most seriously, resurrects a ghost that Formula One has been trying to bury for years: the systematic bias against certain drivers, including the only black world champion in the history of the sport. Since his first years in the category, Hamilton has pointed out many times quietly, sometimes directly, that not all drivers are treated equally. The 2025 Mexican GP gave new arguments for that narrative. In the same race in which he was penalized with 10 seconds for having gained a lasting advantage off the track, other drivers, including his teammate Charles Leclerc and Max Verstappen, performed similar maneuvers, going off the track and cutting corners. None of them were penalized. This double standard was what made Hamilton explode on the radio and later in public statements. His line, "What about all the other cars that have cheated?" It is not a specific complaint, but a frontal accusation of a structure that he considers flawed. And this is not a new topic. Hamilton himself has denounced in other seasons, as occurred in 2021 or 2022, race decisions that, according to him, were not only unfair, but reflected a structural inconsistency in the way the FIA interprets its own rules. For years, he has advocated for greater transparency in penalty criteria and, above all, for renewal in F1's decision-making bodies to reflect the diversity of the sport. But the words have come up against a wall of institutional silence, and what happened in Mexico was, for him, the straw that broke the camel's back. Do you think Hamilton's penalty was fair? Or do you think we're seeing a deeper problem affecting equity in the category? What changes should be implemented to ensure that all drivers are treated to the same standard, regardless of their history, their team, or their media influence? Subscribe to continue uploading more of that content. Now you really think about all this.